Welcome, everyone, to our first in our series of our graduate program history webinars. We are absolutely thrilled to have you with us, and in a moment you will hear why, because we have a wonderful guest lecturer. A couple months ago, Dr. Jordan approached me when we were talking about how to liven up our department community, especially at the graduate program. And he had the wonderful idea of taking advantage of the lessons of Zoom webinars from the year and inviting a series of distinguished authors to come speak to us about their books, about their scholarship, especially in ways that fit into our thematic tracks. So this is our first of 3 historical webinars we'll be holding over this summer, and I'll allow Dr. Jordan to introduce tonight's speaker in just a moment. Tonight's lecture is affiliated with our War and Violence thematic track, and I'm thrilled also to announce that our second historical webinar will take place next month on July 7th at 2 p.m. Central Time. Note the time change, 2 p.m. Central Time, and we will be hearing from Dr. Julia Late, who's a historian at the University of Birkbeck, part of the University of London system, speaking on her new book, The Disappearance of Lydia Harvey, a true story of sex, crime, and the meaning of justice. I will be emailing out a poster for that to our department community tomorrow, so keep your eyes peeled to that. And then that lecture will be part of our Rights and Identity thematic track, and then our final historical webinar attached to our Encounters and Exchanges track will take place the first week of August, and we will provide more details than that as the time arrives. At this moment, though, I'm going to pass over the digital mic to Dr. Jordan to introduce our guest speaker, after which Dr. Nelson will speak for about 40 minutes on her recent book and on the historical craft, and then we will have a Q&A feature. Please, the way that you can contribute, and we hope we get a lot of contributions, the way for you to contribute is if you click the Q&A button at the bottom of the Zoom webinar page, and then you can type in your question. Feel free to start typing in questions as soon as something piques your interest in the lecture, and I promise we will get to it during the Q&A section. You can also go in and like, upvote, whatever the terminology is, questions you find most relevant that other people leave, so we can make sure to address everything you want to discuss. And we will stay as long as you have questions and there's brilliance for Dr. Nelson to impart on us, or until 8:30 p.m., whichever comes first. So without further ado, Dr. Jordan.
Well, thank you, Dr. Park, and good evening, everyone. Tonight, it is my distinct pleasure to introduce my friend and colleague, Dr. Megan Kate Nelson. Megan is a historian of the US Civil War and Reconstruction, with a particular interest in the conflict spaces and environments, and the place of the war in popular culture. She earned her BA in History and Literature from Harvard and a PhD in American Studies from the University of Iowa. She's the author of 3 books, including Ruined Nation, Destruction in the American Civil War, which, as many of you know, is a staple on my graduate syllabi. And most recently, the subject of this evening's lecture, The Three-Cornered War, the Union, the Confederacy, and Native Peoples in the Fight for the West, which was named a top 10 history book of 2020 by Smithsonian Magazine. Megan's work is creative, original, and imaginative, building compelling thematic connections across space and between historiographies. Without losing anything of scholarly rigor, her scholarship has reached a broad public audience. Her work has appeared in the New York Times, in the Washington Post, and in Civil War Monitor. What I think I perhaps admire most about Megan is that she is a prose stylist who takes very seriously the craft of writing. Her work not only amplifies marginalized voices and ranges across new geographies, but tests the very conventions of academic writing. She's not afraid to experiment with form and genre and style. And indeed, during the Q&A, I hope that we can have a discussion not just about the Civil War, but about the historian as writer. Before leaving the academy to write full-time in 2014, Megan taught at Texas Tech, at Cal State Fullerton, at Harvard, and at Brown. Friends, please welcome one of the most engaging and thoughtful historians working today, my friend, Dr. Megan Kate Nelson.
Oh, thank you. That is such a lovely introduction. That's like the best one yet. I'm very excited to be here. Thank you so much for being here with all three of us and with me tonight. I am going to give you just a little bit of background on how the book came to be, and then just a little bit about the details of the war in the far west, which mostly took place in the southwest, as you will see. And along the way, I'm going to introduce you to a couple of the protagonists in the book and the kinds of sources I looked at in trying to build their stories and integrate them into an overall narrative. And along the way, I'll show you a bunch of really awesome visuals here. And as you can see on this title slide, I have a special message for Dr. Jordan, which now I feel bad about after he gave me such a beautiful introduction. But we have a Harvard-Yale thing that goes back for a very long time. So perhaps there will be other comments that we shall make or debates we shall have about that issue, but maybe not. So why don't we get to the war in the far west here? So I actually started thinking about this project while I was writing Ruined Nation, while I was researching that book and teaching, because I was doing kind of broad sweep Civil War history. And I learned about the battles at Valverde and Glorieta Pass. And I was amazed because I grew up in Colorado. I am a Westerner. I had never heard of any of these battles. I had not heard about the fact that Colorado soldiers took part in both of those major battles and in defending the Southwest from a Confederate invasion. I had heard of Sand Creek, but it was always kind of pitched to me in school as part of the Indian Wars and not the Civil War, and certainly had no idea that Native peoples, particularly Chiricahua Apaches and Navajos, had such a big role to play in Civil War history in this region. So I started thinking about it and writing about it, went on a big research trip in 2014, and had decided pretty early on that as Dr. Jordan had said, that I was going to experiment a little bit with writing style. Because I had left the academy, I did not need to really abide by the kind of traditional structure, which I'm sure you're all familiar with and reading widely across the field of history. And I felt like I could do something different with this book. And I especially thought so after doing a bunch of research and figuring out how many different communities were involved in this war in the far west. And by the time I had sort of chosen people to highlight, I had 9 people. And I was trying to figure out how I was going to integrate all of their stories together. And at the time, I was reading a lot of fiction and was noticing that novelists were using this thing called multi-perspective narrative. I was also at the time watching Game of Thrones, which also uses multi-perspective narrative, where you are with one person for a certain amount of time and then you jump to someone else. And I was really interested in the possibilities of that form in allowing me to bring multiple community stories together and kind of interweave them, yet still move through the story of the war in the Southwest over time and through space, but also giving you a kind of grounding in that place and sharing with you the stories of individuals. But first, I had to answer the question of why there was a war in the far west, and in particular, the Southwest, in the first place. In the spring of 1861, the North and the South obviously are kind of starting to ramp up mustering soldiers in, bringing war material, mostly to the East. But they were still concerned about the West, both the US and the Confederacy. And they were concerned about it for 3 reasons. First, for its gold mines, because as we all know, war costs money. You have to pay for it somehow. And there were all of these gold mines in the Rockies and in the Sierras of California that had the ability to provide not only kind of hard money, but also money to back paper currency. So both the US and the Confederacy were interested in that. The Confederacy in particular was interested in the deep water ports of the Pacific because, already a blockade had been declared by the summer of 1861. And this could be a way that the South could get cotton in particular in and out, and other supplies in and out. Because after the secession of Texas in February of 1861, their furthest, as you can see on this map, the furthest west edge of the Confederacy was, not that far from the border of California. All they had to do was march an army through southern New Mexico territory, move into Southern California, and take that region and its ports. Also, there was a third reason, which is that for both white Southerners and white Northerners, there was this idea of what the nation was going to be in the future. For Northerners, there was this vision of the Greater West, which you can see here, coming into the Union as free territory, as part of an empire of free labor. Southerners, of course, saw this very differently. They wanted the West in order to expand their empire of slavery. If they could march that army across New Mexico territory into California, reach the Pacific coast, they would have this coast-to-coast empire. The Southwest would then become a kind of crossroads from which they could either launch another campaign for the Greater West up north or move into Mexico, Latin America, and the Caribbean, and establish themselves as a true nation. So all of these were concerns and interests. And I just want to point out too, we always talk about in the coming of the Civil War, right? The 1840s and 50s, the West is always the center of that conversation. The Mexican-American War, Gadsden Purchase, Wilmot Proviso, all of the talk about the Transcontinental Railroad, the bringing Nebraska and Kansas into the Union. And yet Civil War historians often kind of, once those cannons fire on Fort Sumter, they're like, oh, the West doesn't matter anymore at all. Like, no one is concerned about this at all anymore. And it's a contention of the book that was not the case for all the reasons I noted, and then also for a larger kind of issue, especially for the Union later in the war, that combined the goals of conquest and also a kind of national cohesion. So the Civil War in the Far West occurred in 4 different phases. The first phase was a Confederate invasion. And so at the beginning, as I noted, Texas seceded in February of 1861. And at that point, soldiers started mustering into the Confederate Army. Most of them went to the east, but some of them were recruited specifically to defend Texas. And large groups of soldiers started to come into San Antonio for that purpose. One of them was John Baylor, who was a rancher, a lawyer, a former state legislator, and he had recruited personally almost 300 men to come with him to help defend Texas from both the Union and then also from any indigenous enemies that they may have. And in the summer of 1861, he was given the task of marching along the San Antonio-El Paso road, securing all the federal installations, which had already been abandoned, but garrisoning them with men, and then stopping in El Paso and kind of waiting for orders. So Baylor did that, but as anyone who reads the book will know, in the first chapter, Baylor was not a man who liked to wait around for orders. So he is one of the protagonists in the book. I knew that I wanted to start with him because this is the pivotal moment, the Confederate invasion of New Mexico territory. And it was John Baylor's doing, pretty much solely his doing. By the time he got to El Paso in July of 1861, he had about 300 cavalry left with him. He started hearing rumors that the Union Army was coalescing along the Rio Grande up at Fort Craig in central New Mexico, and those rumors were in fact true. He was also worried about threats from Chiricahua and Mescalero Apaches and also from Navajos. He started to get nervous nervous and he started to get impatient. And so he just decided without orders that he was going to invade New Mexico territory in late July. And he was extremely successful in this move. It took everyone by surprise. He was able to take the town of Mesilla, force the surrender of 400 troops who had been posted at Fort Fillmore by chasing them through the desert and up over the Organ Mountains, and then, you know, taking them and putting them on parole. And after he did that, he returned to Mesilla on August 1st, 1861, and he created the Confederate Territory of Arizona, which resulted in this map and others like it from 1862, where you can see the Confederacy extending now from the Atlantic coast all the way to the border of California. Baylor established the Confederate Territory of Arizona in a different shape than we are used to seeing it. He kind of sliced out the southern part, which of course created this nice marching corridor. It was also quite well known that the southern part of this territory was full of pro-secessionists and Southerners because their migration stream had sort of taken them straight from points in the South all the way across kind of southern New Mexico territory into Southern California. And this was a major accomplishment for Baylor at the beginning of the war. And believe me, he milked it for all it was worth. He had that kind of personality. So one of the things that I did, I think I mentioned before, I took a 4-month research trip at the beginning of this project, and I wanted to see all of the sites that were major sites in the war. And so one of these was this line of march where Baylor was chasing these federal troops across 20 miles of desert and into the Organ Mountains, which are on the right side of this photograph. And what I had not appreciated, and this is one of the things for those of you who are interested in environmental history, and even those of you who are not, going to the place where events occurred that you are writing about is hugely valuable. Not necessarily because you like feel a sense of history, but that you understand sort of what occurred in this place a little bit better. And what I understood, and you can't quite tell, maybe you can tell a little bit from this photograph and the way that it's moving from left to right. What I had not understood from all of the military reports and the letters and the diary entries about this moment, you know, people wrote about, these men in particular wrote about kind of moving through the desert and the water wagons slowing down and lagging behind, and all the men who had no water, kind of, you know, this is late July, it's in the high 90s in this part of the New Mexico Territory desert. And they were falling by the wayside. And part of the reason he was able to force their surrender is that most of them were incapacitated by dehydration and sunstroke. And I was like, okay, well, I can see that they're moving through 20 miles of desert. But what I didn't appreciate until I was there was that they were steadily moving uphill through that desert. They were moving on an incline at about a 2% grade, which any of you who ride bikes or drive a stick shift will know that doesn't seem like much. And yet you become aware of it quite quickly. So then that just helped me make more sense of the written records, right? I was like, oh, well, of course, they're moving uphill, everyone's slowing down. You're getting that kind of physical reaction to that exertion of moving your body through space, but you're kind of moving up in elevation. And then the elevation really kicked up here at the Organ Mountains, which you can see are pretty jagged, steep peaks here on the right. So that was one of the ways in which I kind of uncovered part of the story, is that I went to that place. And in fact, I went to almost every site that I write about in the book, except for Valverde, which I was not able to access because it is still on private land, interestingly, owned by Ted Turner. So this is one of the things I think we could talk about if you have questions about this too, about where the marks of this war are kind of in the landscape, and how do we acknowledge those? How do we emphasize those? How do we kind of work those places into our studies? So following Baylor in the fall of 1861 was Henry Hopkins Sibley, who was a career military officer who'd been posted in the Southwest. He'd been in Taos when the war began, and then he resigned his commission, went directly to Richmond, pitched a plan to Jefferson Davis to invade New Mexico territory with troops from Texas, was given permission to raise his troops in whatever manner he wished, and to just get it done. So he returned to Texas, started recruiting troops just about the same time that Baylor left to go to El Paso. There were lots of delays. Henry Hopkins Sibley was many things, but he was not a particularly good logistical manager. So there were lots of delays, lots of complaints from the soldiers about just sitting around camp. And they didn't end up leaving for El Paso on the march until about the end of October, early November. So they made their way to El Paso, joined Baylor there around Christmas time in the January of 1862. By the time they got there, they had to recover for about a month because they had marched all the way through West Texas. For those of you who are from there or who have been there, you know what this landscape looks like. These guys were on horseback, but they did a lot of walking to save their mounts, and there was not a lot of water, increasingly very little water on this march. And they ended up being staggered in order to manage resources. But they were pretty wiped out when they got there and they had to wait. And this just gave Union troops under E.R.S. Canby time to train and to coalesce at Fort Craig. Sibley decided to march north, met the US soldiers at the Battle of Valverde on February 21st. The Confederates actually won that battle with a last-minute charge at the end of the day, which was a great victory for them. However, by meeting at Valverde instead of at Fort Craig, they lost the opportunity to sack that fort. And this had been part of Sibley's plan all along, that he would subsist his men along the road and that they would be able to buy supplies from Hispano-New Mexicans, and that they would sack all of the federal forts and take all of their supplies and their food. So he lost that chance. And now Sibley's troops had Canby's soldiers in their rear, and they didn't know exactly what was ahead of them. Ultimately, it would be about 2,000 Colorado soldiers, but they didn't know that at the time. So they kept marching north. They took Albuquerque, they took Santa Fe, and then they were pretty desperate for supplies by that time, by late March. And so they set off on the Santa Fe Trail toward Fort Union, which was one of the largest forts in the region and had a huge amount of supplies. But then they met the aforementioned Colorado soldiers who had been recruited from Denver City and the mining camps and who had marched down on the Double Quick. And they met in two different engagements at Apache Canyon and Glorieta Pass. And ultimately here, the Confederates, Apache Canyon was a draw, but Glorieta Pass was in fact a Confederate victory. They ended up taking the field. However, 1/3 of the federal troops had gotten behind them in their rear and had destroyed their 80 wagon train and let loose all of their animals. And when that happens in a theater of war that is a high desert, your campaign is over. And so it was for the Confederates, because they could not hope to subsist themselves without wagons, without transportation, without a reliable food supply. So here you see the yellow line was the line of their march, and then the blue line is the line of their retreat, where they started that retreat in April of 1862 and did not get back to San Antonio until the summer. So once again, they're moving on the march through West Texas in really inclement weather, ended up losing to illness and to sunstroke and dehydration, a pretty significant number of their troops that they had started with. So this ultimately was the end of the Confederate campaign, the end of phase 2 of the Civil War in the Southwest. Now, one of the soldiers who took part in the Battle of Valverde, and then also took part in tracking soldiers, the Texas soldiers, as they retreated from New Mexico territory, was this guy, Alonzo Ickes, originally from Iowa, had come to Colorado as part of the 1858-59 gold rush. This was another moment in Colorado history that I had never heard about growing up in Colorado. I'd heard about all of the silver mining and the silver lodes of the 1870s and 80s, but I hadn't heard anything about this early gold rush. But it had brought tens of thousands of young men into what would become Colorado Territory right before the war began. And they were all eligible to fight. And many of them ended up signing up for the US Army to defend New Mexico against the Confederate invasion. So Alonzo Ickes was the first of the protagonists I found. And in fact, I went back and I looked at my records, and I actually had looked at his diary at the Denver Public Library in 2010. So like more than 10 years ago, which shocked me, actually. I had not really thought that I had been thinking about this project that early on, because that was while I was writing Ruined Nation, but apparently it was already in my brain. My parents still live in Colorado, so I go to visit them, and that's a convenient way to do research. So Denver Public Library holds his diary, which is still in pretty good shape after 150 plus years. And also there were some publications around that included some transcriptions of his letters. And I knew that I wanted to feature Alonzo Ickes, not only because the issue of gold and gold mining and the mineral West and sort of the fight for these kinds of resources was very important to the war, not only between Union and Confederates, but also between then the Union and indigenous peoples. And so I wanted him to be able to kind of articulate that theme as a protagonist. Also, for those of you who have read the book, you will know that Alonzo Ickes really jumps off the page. Like, he doesn't, you'll read some sources from the 19th century where, you know, some people are kind of covering things up, or you can tell they're kind of lying a little bit, or kind of smoothing over the rough edges of their personality, you know, the kinds of stuff we do kind of on Twitter and Facebook. But he did not. He was very upfront about he and all of his fellow soldiers getting drunk, fighting, you know, being terrified, trying to look out for their friends and failing, not really knowing what they were doing. He was particularly, Alonzo Ickes was particularly racist against the Hispano members of the US Army, members of the 1st New Mexico, who were led by Kit Carson, another protagonist in the book. And again, was very unvarnished about that, like did not cover that up at all. So when you get a source like that, who is so open, and you get a real sense of his personality, you really want to use that source as much as possible. So that's how Alonzo Ickes came to be part of this story. So while the Union and the Confederate armies were battling it out in New Mexico territory, there was another US Army on the move from Los Angeles. Now, this army was under the command of James Henry Carleton, and the initial plan was to move this army through the southern deserts of California, and then, of course, what was New Mexico territory and later became Arizona, to try and help Canby shove the Confederates out of New Mexico territory and back to Texas. They were all ready to go. They were going to leave in late November, early December of 1861, but then they had an extremely unusual weather event that brought 66 inches of rain in 6 weeks to Southern California. And basically the whole of Southern California was just a big lake, and they were not able to move until March or April. So they were too late ultimately to help Canby. By the time they arrived on the Rio Grande, Sibley and his troops were long gone back to San Antonio. But as they marched east, this US Army kind of took back all of this territory and sort of erased the Confederate territory of Arizona and took it back for the Union. On the way, they did have a skirmish with some troops who Baylor had sent out as kind of sentinels to take the town of Tucson and to set up kind of contacts in southern Arizona and then also Southern California. That was Picacho Pass on April 15th. Then they moved on in pursuit of fleeing Confederates, but also kind of on their way to help. And they ran into Chiricahua Apaches at the Battle of Apache Pass in July of 1862. This battle was pretty significant in that Chiricahua Apaches lost control of Apache Spring, which was a vital water source in the middle of their homeland at this point. And it also changed James Henry Carleton's whole approach to dealing with indigenous peoples in this region. At first, he was really willing to negotiate. He had actually negotiated a kind of deal with the Pima and Maricopa peoples of Southern Arizona to provide him with wheat, to be the kind of US Army's quartermasters west of Tucson. And so he was willing to actually negotiate and make trade deals with indigenous peoples. But the Battle of Apache Pass really changed his view. And he decided at that point that should he gain command of the Department of New Mexico, that his next step would be to fight indigenous peoples. And that is, in fact, what happened in the fourth phase of the fourth and final phase of the Civil War in the far west. Carleton did take command from Canby in September of 1862 and almost immediately launched 3 different campaigns against Native peoples, first against Mescalero Apaches, then against Chiricahua Apaches, and then against Navajos. Kit Carson was in charge of, in command of the campaigns against Mescalero Apaches and the Navajos, and Joseph Rodman West was in command of the campaign against Chiricahua Apaches. Despite the fact that the Union Army was able, or I shouldn't really put it that way. They captured Mangus Coloradus, who was a legendary war chief of the Chiricahuas, by luring him into a parley and then imprisoning him. And then soldiers killed him and pretended that he had tried to escape. And they thought that this would be actually quite effective in really kind of stopping the Chiricahua Apache resistance. And in fact, it inflamed it and began the Apache Wars, which lasted through the 1880s. So the US Army was never really able to bring the Chiricahuas to a fight and did not actually succeed in that campaign until much, much later. Their campaigns against the Mescaleros and the Navajos were more successful, and this was because Carson was really able to initiate a hard war against both of these peoples. He launched a winter campaign, well, initially a summer and fall campaign against Navajos, which destroyed a lot of their crops and a lot of their winter shelters. And so by the time the winter rolled around in 1864, they were starving and quite vulnerable and began to surrender to the US Army in large numbers. The US Army forced them on what the Navajo people call the Long Walk to Bosque Redondo, which is a reservation site along the Pecos River that James Henry Carleton had picked out himself against the advice of most of his officers. And it really created one of the great human rights disasters of the American Civil War. Now, Carleton usually gets most of the attention in the discussion of that disaster and in the Union campaigns against Native peoples. But I was really interested to find that there was another person who was a civilian official who had really a larger role than I think we have previously understood in that. And that's John Clark, who was the Surveyor General of New Mexico Territory. Now, we don't usually talk about Surveyor Generals, especially in the context of Civil War history. I found John Clark's diaries at the Chavez Library in Santa Fe. 25 volumes of meticulous diaries that included diary entries and also sketches and maps for his entire time that he was appointed Surveyor General from 1861 to 1868, which is exactly the time frame of the book. I also then found from his diaries that he was writing very regularly to the General Land Office, and the National Archives has all of those records, and you can see them stuffed into this archive box. So I went to the National Archives, I read every single one of these letters, and you can see they're very folded. And one of the little gems that was in there was this plat map of Santa Fe, which I don't think anyone had ever seen really before. It's not in a lot of books about Santa Fe as a town. And I get the sense, and you can see from the folds, I always felt like Clark wrote these letters, folded them up, sent them off. Someone at the General Land Office, clerk probably, opened them up and read them, folded them back up and put them in storage. And whatever librarian had kind of gone through these and looked at them in order to note their metadata, and I were like really the only people to look at them after that, because they are in pristine condition. The wax seals still on them, very little fading in the writing, just like beautiful, beautiful documents. So here I have this just like wealth of information from John Clark, who is a Republican appointee. He's a steadfast Republican, a friend of Lincoln. And while he's in New Mexico, he surveys public land in New Mexico. He goes to Arizona to check out a gold strike that occurred in 1863 that helped Carleton to defend and explain his campaigns against Navajos in particular, because the road to those gold fields was going right through Navajo territory, the northern access. He also surveyed Bosque Redondo as a reservation site, although it was also his view that it was an inappropriate site and would not be able to sustain 10,000 people in that space, either to live or to provide for themselves. But Clark is one of these unexpected people I think a lot of times we run into in our research, where you think, oh, okay, well, maybe I can use these documents that he created for some single purpose. And then once you really dig into them, it becomes part of a much larger story. So one of those serendipitous moments in the archives that we all love. So as I noted, Bosque Redondo was a really terrible place to be imprisoned. And in fact, Carleton referred to Navajos at Bosque Redondo as prisoners. And the site was being run by the Department of War, not the Department of the Interior or the Office of Indian Affairs at this point. And there was some wrangling about that kind of at the end of this era. But the site was terrible for multiple reasons. The Pecos in this region is pretty salty and alkaline. It was not great for growing crops. They had a lot of really bad luck with weather. Also, it was so far from the Santa Fe Trail that it was incredibly expensive and to bring any kind of provisions in. And really, Navajo people suffered through this entire 4 years and ended up calling Bosque Redondo Whaledy, or land of suffering. And they experienced a 25% mortality rate at Bosque Redondo during these 4 years, which, I think is quite comparable. I think we can consider it alongside prison camps like Andersonville. And the person whose story I wanted to tell so that readers could really get a sense of the Navajo experience on the ground was Juanita. She was a teenager at the start of the war. She was married to Manuelito, who was a major headman of the Navajo people. The US Army knew very well who he was and made it a goal to capture him. Juanita and Manuelito and their band evaded US troops until 1866, when they were starving and forced to surrender, and then went to Bosque Redondo. Juanita is an interesting example as a historical subject in terms of research, because she did not leave any written records behind. And she did leave some oral histories that came down through her descendants. And one of those descendants is a historian at the University of New Mexico named Jennifer Nez Dinedale. And because she wrote a book about Juanita and has written several articles, I was luckily able to access that and access her story. And one of the things that really interested me too, Juanita was a weaver. This is actually a photograph of her from 1874, when she was part of the Navajo delegation that visited President Ulysses S. Grant. And you can see the photographer took photographs of her with a bunch of different weavings. And this is because she was well known as a weaver, and textiles were an incredibly important part of the Navajo economy, and they were completely under the domain of women. And I thought that was an interesting story to tell. And it turned out when I visited the Navajo Nation Museum, it became clear to me that there was a real moment at Bosque Redondo that really changed the way that women dealt with their sheep, the way that they spun the wool, the way that they wove these blankets that were so important to them, both personally and also for the greater community in terms of trade. Now, on the left side of the slide, you see a chief blanket, which is this particular kind of style is the more traditional pre-Bosque Redondo style with these stripes and larger diamonds, very simple lines, rich colors, usually only like 3 colors, and dyed with plants that are found in Navajo homelands. On the right-hand side, you see the Germantown Eye Dazzler, which is what this came to be called because Carleton did not allow Navajos to keep large herds of sheep. He did want women though to weave their own blankets. And so he had sheep imported. They were a different kind of sheep than Navajos were used to. He also brought in Germantown yarn, which is like the kind of synthetically dyed for women to use. And so you can see all of the different colors that Navajo weavers have access to at this moment. They are not natural dyes. They are not part of the kind of homeland landscape, which is significant. They also start to change a lot of the shapes and the designs of the weavings at this point. So I thought that was a really interesting moment where you see Navajo women like Juanita kind of taking their circumstances and using those to survive and to persist. And I really wanted that to be a theme of the second half of the Three Cornered War, that the Navajo experience is one of suffering, but it is also one of survival. So ultimately, what do we learn when we look at the Civil War? We look at any kind of war or acts of violence from unexpected places that we're not used to talking about. For my purposes here, I think what we learn is that the Civil War is really a continental conflict. We think about it as a war between the North and the South, but it was a war that was between the North and the South and the West, and also about the West in many respects. That it included multiple groups of people who we also don't talk about. We don't usually talk about Hispanos and indigenous peoples when we talk about the Civil War. They are not part of the story in the Eastern Theater, so they often get left out. So you're bringing in other people's stories. People in the West did have a Civil War experience. They were not just reading about it. They were not just deployed to the East. They were experiencing the Civil War and engaging in it from the West. And then I also think we see when you go to unexpected places, I think we also start to use different kinds of methodologies. It sort of necessarily encourages us to experiment more with, okay, well, if there aren't any written documents here, then what can I use? What different kinds of material culture, what kinds of visual culture can I use the landscape itself to tell this story? And so when we see the war in this light and we approach the war and acts of violence from a different kind of angle of vision, I think it enables us to tell a fuller and more kind of capacious story than we otherwise would. So I will stop there and we can get to any questions that you may have.
All right. Well, I want to thank you. Let's see if I can. Yeah. I want to thank you for such a fascinating presentation, Dr. Nelson. This has been phenomenal. I will say I was raised in New Mexico. I even spent my summers at a boys choir camp in Glorieta Pass, and I knew nothing about any of this. So like you, this was fantastic in bringing the Civil War home. We got one question came in the Q&A, which I'll read in a minute, but I want to encourage everyone to go and start asking your questions in the Q&A so we can have a long list of questions to pepper Dr. Nelson with. But maybe I'll start with a question. What led you to choose these specific characters in the book? Because some are obvious. I mean, the generals who are in charge, or but some are a bit less obvious. Maybe some of the indigenous figures who, fleetingly come in and out of the records that you have to do more investigative work on your end. What made you choose which characters you wanted to highlight in this story?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think it's a question that we all have, right? When we start with our projects, like which individuals are we going to highlight? What, what regiment are we going to look at? Right? Like, and, why did we choose those particular people? What story are they telling? I think when I figured out all of the different communities in play, then I was kind of looking at people who to me would be representative of the experience and enable me to actually tell the story. That meant that those people needed to either had to produce a lot of records themselves, or enough for me to kind of get a sense of them, or they had to be connected in some way to other people where I could track them, and then also people were talking about them in a lot of other ways, so that I could get a sense of who they were. I knew their biography. I knew roughly, where they were born, what they were doing, kind of what their role was here. And so, I knew that I needed to have Kit Carson in the book. And because, he is a pivotal figure. He actually bridges the Union Confederate warfare and then the Union Indigenous warfare, and plays a very significant role. And we don't think of Kit Carson in that way as a Union colonel, right? We think of him as a frontier figure, as an Indian fighter. And, to some extent he was here. But I also struggled with him a little bit because I knew that he needed to be a central figure, but he was so mythic that I kind of was like, oh, so if you'll notice in the book, he is actually the only one who does not have a named chapter. He is always included in chapters with other people. And so that was sort of my kind of like, all right, Kit, I'm not going to let you take over.
You're not going to let him bully the other characters. Yeah, he's got to play nice and play well with others.
Yes. Although I have to say, all of the other characters either knew of him or actually knew him and had met him. Like Mangus Coloradus met Kit Carson. Like, okay. As he was acting as a messenger, they traded together because he was moving through a pizzeria. So there were some figures, like you're saying, who are obvious. Carleton, Baylor, these are guys who are significant. We know what they did. Their roles are quite obvious. Louisa Canby, I wanted to include because she tells an interesting civilian story. Also, she always came up in the records, particularly of Confederates, who called her the Angel of Santa Fe for the work that she did in kind of helping the Confederate wounded after the Battle of Glorieta Pass. And then she intrigued me as just one of these characters, these figures in the mid-19th century where you can't even believe the things that they did. Like the fact that she was traveling with E.R.S. Canby, who she called Richard, and the family called Richard, although everyone else in the Army called him Edward, which creates confusion. But, she traveled with him almost everywhere, which included like traveling across the isthmus in Panama and like going to California in 1850, with, this 7-year-old girl in tow named Mary. And so she was just an interesting figure to me. Also, I wanted to include some women because this, so often our Civil War stories, especially when you're dealing with battles and campaigns, it's like very dude heavy, right? So I really it's just all about dudes, and I usually am writing about dudes. So I was happy to be writing about her, and then also about Juanita, who I thought was just a really fascinating figure. And both of those women, interestingly, I could track because of their husbands, because their husbands were themselves being tracked by the US Army. And so I knew where they were and what they were actually doing during this period. And so that was very helpful to me in building their story. I also had the benefit in telling Juanita's story of having access to published oral histories of the Long Walk, of Bosque Redondo, and then also a really good history by a Navajo woman, Ruth Rosell, about Navajo women and their cultural role, their economic role, and that helped me kind of position Juanita in her world. You know, Bill Davidson, another Texan. I knew about him because other historians had collected many of his letters and his accounts of the war. And he was like Alonzo Ickes. He was with the Sibley campaign, which Baylor was not. So I needed someone to tell that story. And he also leapt off the page like Alonzo Ickes. He had a pretty great sense of humor. You know, he was a diehard Confederate. He didn't own any enslaved people himself, but he was very much in support of the Confederacy and the expansion of slavery across the West. And he, you know, took part in every single element of the Sibley campaign. So that was extremely helpful to me. But yeah, I mean, I went back and forth a lot in the beginning.
So really good questions pouring in now. Let me build on that last one. Riley Sullivan asked or talked about how your book compares to Amy Greenberg's A Wicked War, which some scholars have described as a group by a composition of mini biographies, kind of a group
Right.
biographies. I'm wondering, you've already touched on this a bit, so you can be quick on this, but what do you think are the benefits of the group biographies approach? And then what might be some of the downsides of framing a story that way?
Yeah, definitely. I think the benefit is that readers really get to feel like they know who these people are and understand why they're doing the things we do. Or why they're doing the things that they're doing. You know, so often, especially in Civil War history, and I know Brian knows this, like, and I've done this too in my previous work, I treat people as just like evidence that I'm compiling, right? Like I have 12 people who are saying the same thing about ruins, and I'm going to pick the best one, and I'm going to introduce him to you by his rank and his regiment, and maybe like where he's from, and then I'm just going to give you the quote, and that's it, and that's all you'll ever know about it, right? Like we treat people just as like compiled evidence for us to make our arguments. And so with this, I wanted readers to be on the ground with all of these people and to kind of understand what their lives were like, not to excuse or approve of any actions they may have taken, but just to understand why they did what they did. And so that was great. Doing a group biography of 9 people, I would not really recommend to anyone who does not like fully want to engage with that, because that was a lot. Like that, it took me, you know, this book took 4 or 5 years to research and write, which, you know, I think for academics is probably about average, but it was, you know, I was like doing deep dives into people's lives, 9 people. And that took a lot of time, and it was a lot of details to kind of wrangle. And I left a lot of stuff on the cutting room floor. I cut 60,000 words from this book manuscript, which is about a third of it. And also a lot of really great stories about these people's lives just were like, whoosh, nope, can't talk about those. So you get kind of, it can be a little overwhelming to do the group biography. It can be, and for researchers, and then sometimes probably for readers as well.
Excellent. All right. A couple, James Good has some really good questions and a comment. I'm going to read the comment first and then the 2 questions, and you can address either or both at your discretion. The comment: I really enjoyed the way you weave geography and environment into your narrative. And then the 2 questions: 1, what's your advice for folks looking to thread the needle between popular and academic history? And 2, in your mind, what realistically could the Confederate States have accomplished in the West? It seems like it would have been doomed no matter what.
Okay, why don't I take the second one first? You know, I mean, I think we talk about the like what would have been and could it have happened, and you know, was the plan actually viable? I don't think Sibley's plan of self-sustenance was viable. Like that was just given the high desert. And this is one of those unaccountable things where you're like, Sibley, dude, like you have served in this region, like, but he made a couple of miscalculations. He thought that Hispano-New Mexicans were going to come with the Confederacy. And he completely just disregarded or forgot or didn't know about the 1841 invasion, where Texans tried to take Santa Fe. And the New Mexicans who had been living there at the time, many of them still living there. So the fact that the invading Confederate army was all Texans, that if you're going to say that it was doomed from the start, like that is probably, what doomed it in many respects. But, history, it's always contingent, right? If Sibley had been better at logistics, if he had not been a drunk, if he, had done a better job, or if he had decided not to go north, but to go directly west and stop in Tucson and then just drive all the way, he would have met Carleton's men coming out, but he would have met them in the middle of the desert, and that would have been interesting but I also think one of the things that determined what happened in this theater is that on both sides, I mean, we always talk about, and Brian knows this too, I think, the debate about the importance of this region has a lot to do with numbers. It has a lot to do with scale. So most people say, it doesn't matter. There were only 8,000 men engaged. But what you don't realize is that those were the largest armies that this region had ever seen, which included Spanish and Mexican armies. It included the American armies of the Mexican-American War. I mean, it's just huge numbers. And when you're talking about fighting in a theater of war where you don't have a lot of water and the agricultural base is not huge, and the civilians are hostile to an invading force, that is a huge problem. And they were so dependent on those wagons. And when they got burned at Glorieta, it was just over. So I would say there was contingency there, but the odds were against the Confederates from the start. If everything had aligned for them, they might have been able to kind of get it done. And it would have been interesting. And this was, one of the questions, which I don't really get into, Ben, but it would have been interesting to see if the Mormons would have come with them. I mean, they were right there in a pivotal place, and they had a very well-trained group of soldiers at their disposal. So that would have been interesting to know. I mean, ultimately, I think Brigham Young was he and Lincoln had a kind of, I'll let you alone, you let me alone, and everything will be fine. But I mean, if Sibley had made it to Denver and had come over the mountains, I mean, I don't know. But that's a really good question. But so the second question about threading the needle, I mean, I think it depends on whether you want an academic career or whether you want to do something else. I mean, I think there's a lot of room in academia for writers who write really well, right, about their topics. What there's not a lot of room for is people messing with structure and experimenting with different kinds of writing styles, like inserting the I voice and really heavy memoir. That Civil War history in particular is very conservative where that is concerned. I mean, we know, people, and I've always argued this, it's not actually, a lot of academic writers, present company included, are really beautiful writers, really lovely writers. So that's not the issue. I don't think that Civil War historians, I don't think that most historians use a lot of jargon or write in a way that is particularly alienating. But the academic structure that's expected and traditional in articles and in books is very embedded, and it's really hard to get away from that, especially I think in journals. Academic journals will not let you play around in the featured article part. Sometimes they'll be like, oh, you can write this like little weird piece that we'll put at the end and silo as creative, but
or leave online as part of our online content.
right, the online content. But for the most part, they're going to expect, and peer reviewers will expect, the very traditional, like, descriptive moment at the outset, the wheel and turn to the argument and historiography, and then a structurally based, argumentatively driven, if it's an article, different sections of the article, if it's a book, chapters, and I've written in that mode before, like we all have, right? And we all do, because that is what is expected. And I think it's going to take a lot to convince academia to like actually embrace and reward experimentation in historical writing. And I've been pushing for it, and I would love to see it. I would love to see like prizes established in our field that are specifically for writing, that are like, this is actually for someone who's like messing with genre, or like doing something really interesting, or writing in this different and interesting way, or connecting something to a digital project, or whatever you happen to be doing. So I know that isn't advice, and that probably makes everyone sad and depressed. But I don't know. I don't know what Ben and Brian think about the options or the possibilities for that.
No, I think you outlined it well. And I will say, for people who want to know more of what Dr. Nelson wants to think on that, or thinks on that topic, check out her blog, History. What is it?
It's like barista.
Historista. That's right. Yeah. So she's got great posts on. We're actually getting a number of really good questions concerning your treatment of Indigenous people. So let me read. Amber Godwin asked two.
Okay.
How many other Native tribes did you find were players in the Civil War in the West, whether fighting for the Confederacy or the Union or protecting their own tribal interests? And two, in the evidence you found, was there a lot of cooperation or conflict within the Southwest tribal alliances during this period? So tribes that were involved in the conflict, and whether many tribes worked together or apart.
Right. Those are great questions. First of all, there were about 20,000 Indigenous men who served in either the Confederate or the US Army during the war. Most of those troops are coming from the East and from Indian Territory, particularly. And there's actually a lot of, if you're interested, there's a lot of really good work on Indian Territory in particular. This is where a lot of that work is coming from, because, and I actually think one of my new kind of things that I've been ranting about is that we need to start thinking about, Civil War historians need to start thinking about New Mexico Territory and Indian Territory as border states. That we should think of them in the same light, because they have a divided populace with a history of enslavement. The Union and the Confederacy wanted the allegiance of both of those places, and sent kind of diplomats and civilian officials to try and secure those areas, and actively defended them. Although the US Army didn't do as good of a job in Indian Territory. The Confederates actually did a very good job establishing alliances there. So Indian Territory becomes a really interesting place to think about indigeneity in that very complicated relationship of Indigenous communities to enslavement and to white communities across the South. And so that's kind of one area. Another focus that has really become of interest to historians recently is the Dakota War in 1862 in Minnesota, where the US Army, engages with Dakota peoples in the kind of late summer, fall of 1862, end up defeating the Dakota peoples and slating, I think, more than 300 of them, possibly 400. for the death penalty for a kind of as enemy combatants. And, you know, Lincoln gets involved, he commutes all of those sentences except for, you know, kind of 30, I think it's 38. But that is the largest mass execution in American history is of indigenous peoples in the Dakota War. So there's that conflict. And then there's, you know, the action and the kind of influence and the shaping of indigenous communities in the Southwest, in Chiricahua Apache and Mescalero Apache and Navajo communities, which, you know, my book is dealing with 3 communities that had a very intensive experience with US and Confederate troops during the Civil War. That wasn't the case for every indigenous community. And in fact, this is one of the areas I think we need a lot more work on. And if you're interested in this, we definitely need master's theses and dissertations like on individual indigenous communities across the West and also in the Midwest and the East and their experiences in the war, whether they volunteered for the war, whether they acted as scouts or spies, whether they engaged by trading like the Pima and Maricopa peoples did in southern Arizona with both initially the Confederate and then US troops under Carleton. There were a lot of different ways for indigenous communities to engage. And also in the Southwest and in other areas, I think many of the Plains tribes also engaged in this. Raiding warfare kind of continued to pace and even accelerated because suddenly there are all these troops on the move. There are troops and civilians on the move with these huge wagon trains, with all these supplies, with all these animals. And, you know, this was an amazing opportunity to exploit for many indigenous communities. But then there are other groups where there's no touch at all. There's no contact with the US Army or with the Confederates really in any kind of way. So it's important to recognize that diversity. But again, we need studies of so many different areas because that experience was so diverse. There was not just one Indian America, right, that had the exact same experience or the exact same loyalties. And again, and I think that also is the case with their particular intertribal relationships. Some continued to be enemies. Some fought one another with US troops. The Battle of Adobe Walls, which Kit Carson, that was his last major battle that he was in command of. He fought Kiowas and Comanches at Adobe Walls. And in his first New Mexico, there were Hispano soldiers, Anglo soldiers, Navajo and Mescalero Apache, Jicarilla Apache, and Ute scouts and spies. Like, it's like, so you know, sometimes indigenous groups are using US troops in order to engage in battles with one another. Sometimes they're engaging directly with US troops over, you know, land rights. Sometimes they're making treaties or agreements. I mean, it all really depends. It was all quite fluid and dynamic. And I think actually Mangus Coloradus' story in the Three Cornered War really reveals that he was actually quite willing to engage in multiple points of contact with the US and the Confederate Army. He was willing to engage with them in multiple ways to get what he wanted and what he needed for his people.
Excellent. You actually answered a couple of questions there. In fact, Dr. Biskupska on the faculty answered a question of how Native American perspectives designated the Civil War, and you answered that. So I'm going to mark that one down. And I'm now going to combine a couple of questions that I think go together well, and you can answer however you see fit. One from Dean Rogers is, what was the most surprising thing you learned in the research process? And connected to that, Jim Taylor asks, who or what side, Union, Confederate, or Indigenous people, did you find yourself rooting for when researching the Civil War in the West? And did this change from your initial personal biases heading into the project?
Interesting. Okay, wait, remind me of the first one.
What surprised you most?
Oh, right, okay. I think what surprised me most is how many of my 9 protagonists either knew each other or wanted to know each other or cross paths at certain points. I mean, you're talking about a humongous region, right? You're talking about this big, enormous, I mean, you guys know, you live in Texas. I mean, you know how big it is. This is like if, you know, someone from San Antonio runs into someone from Lubbock and it's like, hey, I know you, right? Like, I mean, it's this, it was truly wild to see. Some of them were in the same place at the same time. Some of them, again, like John Clark and James Carlton were sort of obsessed with Kit Carson. They had like a bromantic kind of situation going. Like they were like, oh, hey, hi, let's talk, let's get together, you know, and Carlton, for him, that had been longstanding. Like they had served in the U.S. Army together in New Mexico in the 1850s. So his man crush had been going on for quite some time. But you know, the fact that they all kind of had heard of one another or knew one another, it's such a like wild thing to think about, not only for that era, you know, when you don't have the kinds of communications that we have here today that connect us to people that make, you know, like Twitter. We've never met like any of these people, but you're like, we're best friends. But in this kind of moment in the 1860s, I think that was the most surprising thing to me, that across these vast distances, that these individuals would cross paths so often, and would turn out to kind of know each other in certain circumstances. Okay, and now the second question.
The second question was about who did you think you were going to be rooting for among the sides going into the project, and did that change at all as you were working on it?
I don't think it really, I went into it thinking, you know, this is going to be a story that celebrates this particular point of view. I think I had never done any kind of Indigenous history before this project, like in any intensive kind of way. You know, I had read, you know, across certain subject areas and other time periods, but I think really being able to delve into Mangus Coloradus' story and Juanita's story, and especially the story of the Navajo Long Walk in Bosque Redondo. I've been to Bosque Redondo several times, and every time I go there, it really just is haunting. And just kind of know what happened there. And there's actually that memorial site is really, and it was initially focused on Fort Sumner, which was the US Army post. And then on the path to the fort ruins, Navajo people had started to, they had put up a plaque to kind of recognize how many people had died there. And then people just started bringing items and placing them on that plaque and that rock and creating their own kind of memorial. And by the time I saw it, like someone had brought a Purple Heart medal and put it there. And after some amount of time, and I think actually it was a Navajo high school group that came to Bosque Redondo, they saw that memorial, and two of the students, this was in the 1990s, said, we need like an actual space. We need a memorial. Why is the Navajo experience not articulated in this landscape? And so they raised money and they have a museum there. And every time I go, it's kind of a new experience where you really do feel the suffering of that community and what that experience, I mean, you can't fully know what it would have been like, but to be forcibly removed from your homeland and marched 400 miles on foot to a place where you'd never been, to a completely alien landscape, and told that you needed to, you know, plant corn in a way that you had never planted corn before, and do all of this and somehow survive. So that, I think that part of the story, I think is really, I think Juanita's story is really the heart of the book. And I don't think I knew that that was going to be the case going in. I think I hated Baylor pretty much from the start. Although doing research into him, and finding out that he, wrote love poems to his wife and had bouts of depression. I mean, this helped me to understand him more, but I still really disliked him. And I think in terms of the people who I really did not feel any kind of sympathy for, he was one, and then James Carleton. If there's any kind of, if it's, if there are villains and heroes in this story, Carleton is probably emerges as the number one villain, which is also a story that we're not used to telling, right? Like he's a U.S. officer, he's a commander of a department, and that's not often. I mean, I think in many cases, Civil War historians are used to kind of telling the U.S. side of the story as the victorious one and the one that was morally correct. And that is definitely true in many cases, but in this case, the U.S. Army campaigns against Native peoples were real. I mean, that's a hard truth to have to acknowledge.
That's a great question, or a great answer. So I have two questions that I'm going to combine because they're both related, and then we have one simple question that I'll save for the end. Unless anyone else adds any more questions, we'll be able to wrap it up then. These two questions talk about the place of the West in Civil War historiography. I'm going to start with the simple one that's from Samuel Tucker. How do you feel the war in the West affected the overall outcome of the war? And why do you think past historians have largely ignored the far West? So that's the general question. I'm sure you have an answer. Now I have a more direct question from our own plant, Dr. Jordan, who's trying to catch you on a really smart, sophisticated question related to that. Your book harmonizes with an exciting recent body of scholarship that has helped to reveal the expansionist ambitions of the Confederacy. But I think no less important is what you reveal about the nature of the US war effort. How does bringing the West into the conversation help us to rethink hard war, the character of the war's violence, and the connective tissue between the Civil War and the post-war conflicts with indigenous peoples? Where does this leave the so-called freedom narrative of the Civil War history?
Those are both great questions. So I've had a lot to say about the place of the West in Civil War history. I've had a lot of fights with people who think that the West does not matter still. And I mean, part of it is, I mean, no Civil War historian disputes that the Eastern Theater and some parts of the Trans-Mississippi were vital militarily, right? That they are this is where all the action is happening. I would never argue that the theater in the far West was the most important theater of the war. That would never, I do not make that argument. But it is interesting because of the Confederate failure to take the West. And they never try again. John Baylor tries to convince the Confederate, he actually gets elected to Confederate Congress, like at the end of the war, and he keeps meeting with Jefferson Davis, trying to convince him that he can go do this and take an army actually up the Pecos, that they would go up that way, and they would just end around the Rio Grande and just go straight up to Denver and across the mountains. But they never went back again. And the reason I think that's significant for the Confederates is that their kind of access to any Pacific ports or any really, really impactful help from Mexico just ends. So they suffer more and more from the blockade. Their financial situation gets more and more dire. And I think that actually, you can see the ramifications of that, maybe not directly on the battlefields in the East, and the Trans-Mississippi West, but certainly indirectly. Where I think it actually had a bigger impact was on US policy, because it's very interesting to note that the major expansionist pieces of legislation that the US Congress passes, they pass in the wake of the Confederate retreat to Texas. Once they know that New Mexico territory is secure, They pass the Pacific Railway Act, they pass the Homestead Act, they pass the Morrill Land Grant Act, they create the Department of Agriculture, all of these things. And, because this is one of those questions, like, why are they bothering? They're in the middle of a war. Like, why? Right? You would think that they had better things to do. They had better legislation to pass and things to focus on to keep, their armies in the field alive in all of their different theaters of the war, right? But they are passing these measures that Republicans have been trying to pass in the 1850s, but Southern Democrats have been stopping them. And all of those measures are about conquering the West. And all of those measures necessitate and enable land taking from indigenous nations. It's either written explicitly as it is in the Pacific Railway Act, where it's like all Indian land titles will be expunged along the route of the Transcontinental Railroad, right? They're just going to take the land. They don't care whose it is. And then the Homestead Act, of course, is giving land over to loyal US citizens, which is not going to include indigenous peoples, right? Could later then include freed people, African Americans and free Black Americans, but certainly not indigenous peoples. So I think when we look at the war politically, and we look at these and economically for the US, this is where we really see the war in the West affect and impact that policy. Because all of that begins to work together so that the Homestead Act, Pacific Railway Act, and then everything that John Clark is doing in New Mexico, the US campaigns against Native peoples, which incidentally really prefigure the stance that the US Army will take in the late 1870s against indigenous nations across the West, which is no more treaties, right? Which actually happens in 1871. So no more treaties. This is Carleton's thing. He's like, we're not going to do any treaties. Instead, we're going to start with war. We're going to force you to surrender, and then we're going to remove you to reservations. And you're just not going to have any say because we have more people, right? And I think this is where hard war comes in also, per Brian's question. I mean, this is part of the expansionist war effort is a hard war against indigenous communities. Explicitly, where Kit Carson is concerned in the Navajo campaign, kind of moving through and decimating everything so that Navajos were really in a starving condition by the time winter hits, which is a very vulnerable time anyway for indigenous communities. So there's either explicit US Army campaigns against indigenous groups on behalf of the US and its expansionist goals, or there are other kind of movements that enable settler colonialism, which itself is a kind of hard war because you are taking land away, you are moving in. The Transcontinental Railroad basically cuts the bison migration pathway in half and really affects the way that Plains tribes are engaging with that really vital element of their survival and of their, kind of community strength. And so these are all acts, I mean, I know there's a lot of debate in Civil War history, like you can't expand a notion so far that it no longer has any meaning, right? Like you can't say hard war is everything or else it becomes nothing. But I think when we look at the situation in the West during the Civil War, we start to see hard war differently and different kind of elements of that strategy impacting indigenous peoples directly. Sometimes indirectly, but more often directly. Did I get all of that question?
Yeah.
Yeah, the freedom narrative. I mean, this is the problem, right? I mean, there's, and we're seeing this in the debate about memorials, about monuments, right, to Union soldiers. And the monument in Santa Fe is a really complicated monument, right? Because it is a monument to US soldiers, and it explicitly says, who fought rebels and defeated them, and also savage Indians, right? it acknowledges the Three-Cornered War. It also makes it it's like, well, then who, especially since that US Army was both Anglo and Hispano, it is extremely complicated. Like, and it also, I've had people argue to me that the US Army's actions against Native peoples couldn't be white supremacist because Hispanos engaged in it. But then we have to say, but Hispanos can still engage in a white supremacist project because it directly benefits them, right? In this context, in New Mexico territory. And so that really, it really makes it problematic, our vision of, oh, the US is, the US Army and the government and Lincoln and Republicans are fighting, against slavery and for emancipation. This is the Union cause. This is what everyone believes in. And when you go to the West, it really unsettles that, because you really see that the US Army is fighting for emancipation in the East, but for Indian extermination and removal, for unfreedom, right, in the West. And people don't like it, right? When you complicate that vision, when you say, actually, this wasn't so great. And this is, I think, also what the work on the Dakota War is also doing, because Lincoln was involved in that so directly. It really unsettles our notions of him and his life and his presidency, and he was, like most other 19th century white people, he did not believe that Native people were Americans. He did not believe they were potential citizens necessarily, and he didn't really think of them as fully human. So, this, and in that way, he was very much a part of his culture and his time. But we don't like to think about that. Right? Americans don't like to think about that because Lincoln is our best president we've ever had. He cannot have been like a racist in some ways.
Well, let's get on one final question so we can have a cleanser from devaluing our best president there.
Okay.
No, final question. It's a fun question, and it could leave us on a high note from Dean Rogers. What was the most difficult part of researching this project, and how did you overcome it?
Oh, I think the part of the research that was the hardest was dealing with a source base that actually was not really prodigious. I mean, in my previous project in Ruined Nation, I could have continued researching that project for 10 years. Probably longer, right? Just more and more, like so much material produced in the East, Eastern Theater and the Trans-Mississippi West, there's so much stuff. And by comparison, the documentary base in the Southwest is not large. I had no photographs, which, if you know about my interest in using visual culture and my belief that we should be using it as evidence, not just as illustration, that was a huge bummer because I didn't really get to, I had pictures of people, portrait photographs, but I didn't have there were no photographs of battlefields. There were nothing like the kind of sources that we have for the East. And, but I saw that instead of as a huge problem, as a real challenge. So then how do I look at other kinds of things, either the landscape or material culture, or what other ways can I access this place in this time to really understand what happened here most fully, and then also write about it and convey it to readers. So really it was that kind of turn, and I'm an American Studies PhD, so I'm very comfortable with interdisciplinary method, and I will basically use anything that I can get my hands on. And in places like the Southwest, actually, we're really lucky because a lot of these sites are still there. They have not been turned into parking lots. They have not been turned into mini malls. There's not, or suburban subdivisions. they're still there, and many of them have been preserved. And so that was very helpful to be able to go to those places and to actually understand, what Apache Pass looked like, and then go to Glorieta, which is now saved as a battlefield, although it's incredibly hard to access. If you don't know it's there, it's really hard to understand where it is. And you actually have to go into the Pecos historic site and ask for a code to a gate in order to access it. But once you know it's there, then I think you can understand a little bit more. And I should say too, the burning of the wagon train at Glorieta is sort of an amazing moment for many reasons. One is that the guy who masterminded that was not a military guy. He was a lawyer from Denver named John Slew. And he's a lawyer, right? So he reads books. So he volunteers, for the war, gets a commission, finds himself in command, and had read these military things. And he was like, oh, well, why don't we do a flanking maneuver? That seems like it could work, right? And so he sends John Shivington, who later is the evil mastermind behind Sand Creek, sends him up to climb up Glorieta Mesa and come around the back. They destroy this wagon train. It's a hugely important moment because, of course, it ends the Confederate campaign. But also for historians, it is a terrible moment. Because when they burned all of that stuff, they burned all of the Confederates' records, their letters, their diaries. They had not had a chance to send them. Once they had passed Fort Craig, they had no way to get mail back. So all of their records from that point on, we don't have any. I mean, we have memoirs from later, but we have nothing in the moment. And so that's one of those things where I'm like, Glorieta is this really important moment. It's incredible moment, for the US Army. This is da da da. And then historians are like, no. So I had to actually just recreate that using the memoirs of people written after the fact, any kind of histories of Albuquerque and Santa Fe I could get my hands on, and just be really open to any kinds of sources that I could find in any kind of archive or any digital database.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much. This has been so enlightening and engaging, and we've all experienced a true treat here. So everyone digitally thank Dr. Nelson for her wonderful remarks. I promise you everyone's clapping behind their blank screens. Everyone, please be on the lookout. I will be sending out a poster for our next historical webinar, which will take place on Wednesday, July 7th at 2 p.m. And before then, I encourage everyone to go out and buy The Three-Cornered War, authored by Megan Kate Nelson. And everyone, have a great day.
All right. Thanks, you guys. Thanks for being here.